The crack of a rifle shot echoed through the mountain pass as Willa Thompson held her breath, her hands trembling as she counted the coins hidden in her apron pocket for the third time. $5.73, all that remained of her mother's legacy, and nowhere near enough to escape the fate awaiting her in Silver Creek. Montana Territory, 1878, was no place for a 20-year-old woman alone, especially one whose stepfather had just bartered her away to the wealthiest and most feared man in the county. "Ain't no point in counting it again, girl," her stepfather, Silas, growled from the wagon seat. "The arrangement's been made. Old man Blackwood paid good money for a young wife, and you'll do your duty or find yourself with nothing but the clothes on your back." Willa tucked the coins back into her pocket, feeling the letter from her late mother press against her thigh where she'd hidden it in her undergarments. "My mother never would have wanted this for me," she said softly, her voice nearly lost beneath the creaking wagon wheels. "Your mother ain't here, is she? Been dead 3 winters now. Besides, she was foolish enough to marry me, so I wouldn't put much stock in her judgment." Silas laughed, the sound harsh against the pristine beauty of the Montana wilderness surrounding them. They crested the hill overlooking Silver Creek, a sprawling mining town nestled between towering pines and rugged mountains. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the distant sound of piano music drifted up from the saloon. To many, it might have looked like civilization. To Willa, it was a prison whose gates were about to close behind her. "We'll be at Blackwood's by sundown," Silas said, snapping the reins. "He's expecting his bride clean and proper like. Best behavior, girl, or you'll regret it." Tears stung Willa's eyes as she stared at her lap. Jeremiah Blackwood was 62 years old, a mining magnate with a reputation for cruelty and 3 previous wives, all dead before their 30th birthdays. The most recent had fallen down the stairs of his mansion just 6 months ago, though whispers around town suggested she'd had help with her fatal tumble. As they descended into town, Willa caught a glimpse of her reflection in a shop window, pale face framed by auburn hair, green eyes wide with fear. She barely recognized herself. 3 years of working herself to exhaustion on Silas's failing farm after her mother's death had hollowed her cheeks and hardened her hands, but she still had her mother's determination etched into the set of her jaw. The wagon rattled past the general store, where a tall man in a dusty duster was tying his horse. He looked up as they passed, and for a brief moment their eyes met. He tipped his hat, a simple courtesy that nonetheless made Willa's heart flutter. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged her as more than property. Silas noticed the exchange and scowled. "Eyes down, girl. You belong to Blackwood now." "I belong to no one," Willa whispered, but only after Silas had turned away. They continued through town, past the saloon where raucous laughter spilled into the street, past the small white church where Willa had once dreamed of a proper wedding, and toward the imposing mansion on the hill, Blackwood's monument to his own success, built on the broken backs of miners and, some said, the bodies of those who opposed him. As they approached the wrought iron gates, Willa's hand closed around the coins in her pocket. $5.73 stood between her and freedom. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The gates swung open as if expecting them, and Willa felt the last of her hope drain away. Hank Mitchell had seen his share of desperate people in his 30 years. 8 years riding with the Texas Rangers and 3 years as a bounty hunter had shown him every shade of human suffering. But something about the young woman in the passing wagon struck him differently. There was a quiet dignity in her posture, despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "That's Silas Thompson's stepdaughter," said Samuel Wilson, the storekeeper, as he counted out Hank's change. "Poor girl. Her mama died a few years back, and now Silas has sold her to old Blackwood. Hank's hand paused over the sack of coffee beans he'd been about to take. Sold her, Samuel nodded solemnly. Called it a marriage arrangement, but everyone knows Blackwood gave him $500 and forgave his debts. That man's gone through wives like most men go through boots. Wears 'em down, then gets new ones when they break. Hank watched the wagon disappear up the hill toward Blackwood's mansion. Doesn't the law have anything to say about that? Samuel laughed bitterly. Blackwood owns the law in Silver Creek. Sheriff's on his payroll, judge too. That girl's as good as condemned. A muscle worked in Hank's jaw as he gathered his supplies. What's her name? Willa Thompson. Sweet girl. Used to come to town with her mother for supplies. Good with numbers, always helped her mama budget their pennies. Ain't seen much of her since Silas took over. Hank nodded, his mind already working through possibilities. He'd come to Silver Creek on business tracking a fugitive who'd reportedly been seen in the area, but something told him his stay might be extended. You got rooms available at your boarding house? Hank asked. Always room for law-abiding folk, Samuel replied. Though if you're planning what I think you might be, I'd advise against it. Men who cross Blackwood tend to disappear. Hank adjusted his gun belt with a slight smile. I've been disappearing for years, Samuel. It's finding me that men have trouble with. As Hank stepped back into the street, his eyes drifted up to the mansion on the hill. His fugitive could wait another day. There was a more pressing injustice that needed addressing. Willa stood rigid as Blackwood circled her, his silver-tipped cane tapping against the polished floor with each step. His study was oppressively ornate leather-bound books lined walls he'd never read. Exotic animal heads stared with glass eyes from their mounts, and a massive desk dominated the center, covered in mining contracts and land deeds. Bit thin, Blackwood commented to Silas, who stood by the door counting his payment. But young, that's what matters. How old did you say? 20, Silas replied without looking up from his money. Good breeding years ahead, Blackwood said with a smile that made Willa's skin crawl. You've had your courses regular, girl. Willa's face flushed with humiliation. I'm not a mare at auction, sir. The back of Blackwood's hand connected with her cheek before she registered he'd moved. You'll speak when spoken to, and only to say yes, sir, or no, sir. I won't tolerate impertinence. Your predecessor never learned that lesson. Willa's eyes watered from the sting, but she refused to cry. Yes, sir, she said, the words acid on her tongue. Blackwood nodded, satisfied. The ceremony will be tomorrow. I've already arranged for the preacher. Nothing elaborate, I've done this enough times. What about her things? Silas asked, finally looking up from his money. What things? Blackwood scoffed. She won't need anything I don't provide. My wife will dress as befits my station. Silas shrugged. Suits me fine, less to haul back. He tucked the money into his coat. We done here. Got a long ride back. We're done, Blackwood said dismissively. Mrs. Hargrove will show the girl to her room. As if on cue, an older woman appeared at the door. Her face was kind, but her eyes held a warning as she gestured for Willa to follow. Goodbye, then, Silas said, not even looking at Willa as he turned to leave. Silas, Willa called, a last desperate attempt. My mother's locket is worth more than you are now, he finished, patting his breast pocket where the silver locket now resided. Consider it payment for the years I fed and housed you. With that, he was gone, and Willa was left with the certainty that by this time tomorrow she would be Mrs. Jeremiah Blackwood, the fourth in a line of women who had entered this house never to leave it alive. Mrs. Hargrove led her silently up a grand staircase to a bedroom that was both luxurious and suffocating. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the late afternoon sun, and a four-poster bed dominated the space. A white wedding dress was laid out, already waiting. It was the last Mrs. Blackwood's, Mrs. Hargrove said quietly. It should fit you well enough. Willa stared at the dress, imagining the woman who had worn it, now lying in the cemetery on the hill behind the house. How did she really die? Mrs. Hargrove's eyes darted to the door nervously. Accidents happen in this house, Miss Thompson, especially to those who ask too many questions. She paused, then added in a whisper, or try to leave. After the housekeeper left, Willa sank onto the edge of the bed, the coins in her pocket pressing into her leg, a reminder of her inadequate resources. $5.73 wouldn't get her far, especially not with Blackwood's men likely to come after her. She crossed to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks that seemed to mock her dark circumstances. Below, in the courtyard, stable hands were tending to horses, and house staff moved between buildings. Her gaze drifted to the iron gates at the property's entrance, closed now, a guard posted. Beyond lay Silver Creek and, farther still, the vast wilderness of the Montana Territory. Freedom, so close and yet unreachable. A movement caught her eye, a rider approaching the gates. Even from this distance, she recognized the man from town, the one who had tipped his hat. The guard stopped him, and they appeared to exchange words. After a moment, the gates opened, and the rider continued up the drive to the main house. Willa let the curtain fall back into place. It didn't matter who the visitor was. By this time tomorrow, she would be trapped in a marriage that was nothing more than sanctioned slavery, with a man who had likely murdered his previous wives. She pulled her mother's letter from its hiding place and read the familiar words once more. Remember, my dearest Willa, that you come from a line of women who bent but never broke. Your grandmother crossed the plains in a wagon with nothing but faith and determination. I survived your father's death and built a new life. You, my darling, are stronger than both of us combined. Whatever comes, face it with courage. Willa folded the letter carefully and returned it to its hiding place. Tomorrow would require all the courage she possessed. Hank approached Blackwood's mansion with a plan forming in his mind. He'd learned from the barkeep at the saloon that Blackwood was holding a small dinner party that evening for some of his mining associates, a celebration of sorts for his upcoming nuptials. A perfect opportunity for Hank to gain entry without raising too many suspicions. At the gates, he put on his most official demeanor. "Evening," he said to the guard. "Name's Hank Mitchell. I'm here on behalf of Judge Parker from Fort Smith. Got some papers for Mr. Blackwood regarding his mining claims in the Eastern Territory." The guard looked skeptical. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't like unexpected visitors." Hank shrugged. "And Judge Parker doesn't like when his couriers have to make return trips because some gate guard wouldn't let them deliver official documents. Your choice, friend. I can leave and tell the judge Mr. Blackwood was too busy to secure his claim to the richest silver vein found this year." The mention of silver caught the guard's attention. After a moment's hesitation, he swung the gate open. "Main house. Someone will meet you at the door." Hank tipped his hat and rode through, his expression neutral despite the satisfaction he felt. People always believed you if you sounded authoritative enough and mentioned money. A stable boy took his horse, and Hank strode confidently to the front door. Before he could knock, it swung open to reveal a butler with a perpetually disapproving expression. "May I help you?" The butler asked, his tone suggesting he had no intention of doing so. "Hank Mitchell for Mr. Blackwood. I have documents from Judge Parker regarding his mining interests." The butler's eyes narrowed, but he stepped aside. "Mr. Blackwood is entertaining guests in the dining room. You may wait in the study." Hank was led through the opulent foyer, past grand paintings and under glittering chandeliers, to a book-lined study that reeked of expensive cigars and brandy. The butler left him there with instructions not to touch anything. Once alone, Hank moved quickly. He wasn't here to deliver papers, he was here to gather information and, if possible, find the girl. A quick search of the desk revealed nothing unusual: business contracts, correspondence about mining operations, invitations to social gatherings. He was about to try the locked drawer when the sound of footsteps in the hallway froze him in place. He quickly moved to the window, assuming a casual pose as if admiring the view. The door opened, and a young maid entered with a tray of brandy and glasses. She startled when she saw him. "Oh. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know anyone was in here." Hank smiled reassuringly. "Just waiting for Mr. Blackwood. You can set that down anywhere." She nodded and placed the tray on a side table, but instead of leaving, she hesitated. Are you here about Miss Thompson?" Hank's interest sharpened, but he kept his expression neutral. "What about Miss Thompson?" The maid glanced nervously at the door. "It's not right what's happening to her. The last Mrs. Blackwood, she wasn't clumsy like they said. She was trying to run away. Where is Miss Thompson now?" Hank asked quietly. "Upstairs, third door on the right, locked in. The wedding's tomorrow morning." She twisted her apron in her hands. "I shouldn't be talking to you." "You're doing the right thing," Hank assured her. "Is there a back way out of the house, one that's not watched?" The maid nodded. "The servants' stairs lead to the kitchen, and there's a door to the garden. The gate in the south wall has a broken lock, that's how." She stopped, swallowing hard. "That's how Mrs. Blackwood was trying to leave." "Thank you," Hank said sincerely. "Now go on about your duties as if nothing's happened." She hurried from the room, and Hank moved to the window again, this time studying the layout of the grounds with greater purpose. The south wall was visible from here. It would be a dash across open ground to reach it, but once darkness fell completely. The door opened again, and this time Jeremiah Blackwood himself entered, followed by two men who had the hard look of hired guns rather than dinner guests. "Mr. Mitchell," Blackwood said, his voice silky with false cordiality. "I understand you have papers for me from Judge Parker." Hank turned, maintaining his composure. "That's correct, sir." "Curious," Blackwood said, moving to his desk. "Since I spoke with Judge Parker just last week, and he mentioned nothing about sending documents." And more curious still, he picked up a telegram from his desk. "When I sent a quick wire to my associate in Fort Smith after hearing of your arrival, he informed me that Judge Parker is currently in St. Louis and has been for the past month." Hank's hand drifted casually toward his sidearm, but one of Blackwood's men already had his gun drawn. "I wouldn't," the man warned. "Now," Blackwood said, settling into his desk chair, "why don't you tell me who you really are and why you're in my home?" Upstairs, Willa paced her room like a caged animal. Dinner had been brought to her, an elegant meal on fine china that she couldn't bring herself to touch. The lock had clicked behind the servant who delivered it, confirming what she already knew. She was a prisoner. She had searched the room thoroughly, looking for anything that might serve as a weapon or tool, but found nothing useful. The windows were sealed shut, and even if she could open them, it was a 30-foot drop to the ground below. A commotion downstairs caught her attention: raised voices, the sound of furniture being moved. She pressed her ear to the door but could make out nothing distinct. Then came a sound she recognized all too well from her years with Sela's, the dull thud of a fist connecting with flesh. Her heart raced. Something was happening downstairs, something violent. In her experience, violence in one part of a house had a way of spreading to others. She needed to be ready. Willa moved to the bed and stripped the sheets, quickly tying them together to form a makeshift rope. It wouldn't reach all the way to the ground, but it might make the fall survivable. She secured one end to the heavy bedpost and tested it with her weight. The sounds from downstairs intensified a crash, a gunshot. Willa jumped at the noise, her hands shaking as she continued her preparations. $5.73 wouldn't get her far, but it would have to be enough. Footsteps pounded up the stairs, and Willa froze. Someone was coming running by the sound of it. She looked frantically around the room for a weapon, finally grabbing a heavy silver hairbrush from the vanity. The lock rattled and Willa positioned herself behind the door, hairbrush raised. The door swung open and she prepared to swing Miss Thompson. A man's voice called softly. She hesitated. It wasn't Blackwood's voice, nor that of his butler or any of the staff she'd met. A man stepped into view, the stranger from town who had tipped his hat. His lip was bleeding, and a bruise was forming around his left eye, but he moved with purpose, scanning the room quickly before his eyes landed on her. "My name is Hank Mitchell," he said urgently. "I don't have time to explain, but if you want to leave this place, you need to come with me now." Willa lowered the hairbrush slightly. "Why should I trust you?" A shout from downstairs and the sound of more footsteps answered her question. "Because Blackwood's men will be here in about 30 seconds, and they're not feeling particularly hospitable," Hank replied. "I'd say I'm your best option at the moment." Willa hesitated only a second longer before nodding. "Which way?" Servant stairs. "Follow me." He turned to leave, then noticed the tied sheets. "Good thinking, but we won't need those. I know a better way out." Willa grabbed her shawl and hurried after him, her heart pounding. This man could be leading her into worse danger, but her instincts told her to trust him, and right now, instinct was all she had. Hank led her down a narrow corridor to a plain wooden door that opened onto a steep staircase. They descended quickly, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. "How did you get in?" Willa whispered as they reached the bottom of the stairs. "Front door," Hank replied with a grim smile. "Getting out will be trickier." The kitchen was empty except for a young maid, the same one who had spoken to Hank earlier. She pointed wordlessly to a door at the back. "Bless you," Hank said, taking Willa's hand and pulling her toward it. They slipped out into the garden just as shouts echoed from the servants' stairway. The night air was cool against Willa's face as they ran, crouching low among ornamental shrubs and flower beds. "There's a broken lock in the south wall," Hank explained in a whisper. "We can get out there and circle back to town." Willa followed him through the darkness, her city shoes ill-suited for the soft garden soil. Behind them, lanterns appeared as Blackwood's men spilled into the garden, their voices raised in alarm. "There they are!" Someone shouted, and a bullet splintered the bark of a tree inches from Willa's head. Hank pulled her behind a stone fountain, drawing his revolver. "Keep going toward that wall," he instructed. "I'll cover you." "I'm not leaving you," Willa protested. "This isn't a debate, Miss Thompson. Go." Another bullet ricocheted off the fountain, sending stone chips flying. Willa hesitated only a moment longer before running in a low crouch toward the shadowy outline of the garden wall. Behind her, Hank fired twice, the shots echoing in the night. The wall loomed before her, higher than she'd expected. She felt along it desperately in the darkness, until her fingers found a wooden gate nearly hidden by ivy. The latch was broken, just as the maid had said, and the gate swung open with a protesting creak. She turned back to see Hank exchanging fire with Blackwood's men, slowly backing toward her position. "Mr. Mitchell," she called. He fired once more before turning and sprinting toward her. A bullet kicked up dirt at his heels, but he reached the gate unharmed, pushing her through before following and pulling it shut behind them. "That won't hold them long," he said. "We need to move." They ran into the pine forest that bordered Blackwood's property, the darkness enveloping them. Willa stumbled over roots and rocks, her breath coming in gasps. Hank kept a firm grip on her hand, guiding her through the trees. Behind them, they could hear Blackwood's men crashing through the gate and into the forest, shouting to each other as they spread out in pursuit. "My horse is at the stables," Hank said as they paused behind a large boulder. "We can't go back for him. We'll have to continue on foot until we can find somewhere safe." "Where are we going?" Willa asked, trying to catch her breath. "Away from here," Hank replied simply. "After that, it's your choice." Willa stared at him in the darkness. "My choice? That's why I came to get you, so you could have one." The simple statement nearly undid her. After years of having every decision made for her by her stepfather, by circumstance, and almost by Blackwood, the idea of choice was almost overwhelming. "I don't even know you," she said quietly. "No, you don't," Hank agreed. "But right now I'm offering you freedom. We can sort out the details later." A shout from nearby cut their conversation short. They pressed closer to the boulder as lantern lights swept through the trees not 50 yards away. "This way," Hank whispered, pointing to a deer trail barely visible in the darkness. As they moved deeper into the forest, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers, Willa realized she had already made her choice the moment she followed this stranger out of Blackwood's mansion. She was choosing the unknown over certain misery, and for the first time in years, she felt something like hope stirring in her chest. The night seemed endless as they pushed through the forest, always listening for sounds of pursuit. Hank set a punishing pace, but Willa matched it without complaint. Each step took her farther from Blackwood, and she would have crawled on hands and knees if necessary. They crossed a shallow stream, walking through the water for several hundred yards to throw off any tracking dogs Blackwood might employ. The cold water numbed Willa's feet, but she welcomed the sensation. It was proof that she was alive, that she was free. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles ahead," Hank said as they finally left the stream. "Used to belong to a man named Jenkins before he moved on to Oregon. We can rest there until morning." "How do you know this area so well?" Willa asked, her teeth chattering slightly from the cold. "I was tracking someone," Hank replied. "A fugitive reported to be working in one of Blackwood's mines. Spent the last 3 days scouting the terrain." "You're a lawman, former Texas Ranger. Now I hunt bounties." The revelation should have frightened her, but instead, Willa found it reassuring. This man knew how to evade pursuit, how to survive in the wilderness. If anyone could help her escape Blackwood, it was him. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was little more than a one-room shack with a partially collapsed roof. But it had a stone fireplace and enough walls standing to provide shelter from the wind that had picked up as the night wore on. "It's not much," Hank said apologetically as he cleared debris from the floor, "but it'll keep us hidden until daylight." "It's perfect," Willa replied, and she meant it. After the gilded cage of Blackwood's mansion, the simple cabin felt like a palace. Hank built a small fire, keeping it low to minimize smoke. The warm glow illuminated his face, showing the bruises and cuts from his confrontation with Blackwood's men more clearly. "Your face," Willa said, stepping closer to examine the damage. "They hurt you," Hank shrugged. "I've had worse." "Why did you do it?" she asked, settling on a fallen beam across from him. "Why risk yourself for a stranger?" Hank poked at the fire, not meeting her eyes. "I've seen what men like Blackwood do to women they consider property. My sister." He paused, his jaw tightening. "My sister married a man like that. By the time I found her, there wasn't much left to save." Willa's heart ached for the pain evident in his voice. "I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," he said, looking up at her finally. But when I saw you in that wagon today, with the same look in your eyes that she had, I couldn't just ride away." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. "What will you do now?" Hank asked eventually. Willa reached into her pocket, pulling out the coin she'd been counting earlier. "$5.73, she said with a small laugh. "Not exactly a fortune to start a new life with." "It's more than many have," Hank observed. "True." Willa stared at the coins in her palm. "I always wanted to go to California. My mother used to read newspaper stories about women finding work there as teachers or shopkeepers, places where a woman alone might make her way. California is a long journey from here." "Yes," she put the coins away, "and Blackwood will be looking for me." Hank nodded grimly. "He's not a man who accepts defeat easily. He'll have telegrams sent to every town within 100 miles by morning." "Then what do? We disappear," Hank said simply. "I have a small ranch north of here, near the Canadian border. It's remote, most people don't even know it exists. You could stay there while we figure out a more permanent solution." Willa looked at him skeptically. "You're offering to take me to your isolated ranch, a woman you just met. Why should I trust that arrangement any more than the one with Blackwood?" Instead of being offended, Hank smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Good, you're cautious. You'll need that." He leaned forward. "I'm not offering you an arrangement, Miss Thompson. I'm offering you shelter while you decide what you want. The cabin has a solid lock from the inside. You'll be as free to leave as you are to stay." Willa studied his face in the firelight, looking for any sign of deception. She found none. "And what do you get out of this?" "The satisfaction of thwarting Jeremiah Blackwood," Hank replied. "That's payment enough for me." She wasn't entirely convinced, but her options were limited. With Blackwood's resources and reach, she wouldn't get far on her own. At least this man had already proven he was willing to risk himself to help her. "All right," she said finally, "but I'll work for my keep. I won't be a charity case." Hank nodded, respecting her pride. "My ranch could use a woman's touch. It's been just me and my dog for 3 years." "You have a dog?" Willa asked, a smile crossing her face for the first time since their escape. "Wolf. Half husky, half who knows what. Found him as a pup after his mother was killed by wolves. He's not much for strangers, but he's loyal to a fault." "Like his owner, it seems," Willa observed quietly. Hank looked away, almost embarrassed by the implied compliment. "We should try to get some rest. Dawn's only a few hours away, and we have a long journey ahead." Willa nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The adrenaline of their escape was wearing off, leaving her drained. Hank offered her his coat to use as a pillow, and she accepted gratefully, curling up near the fire. As she drifted toward sleep, she realized that for the first time in years, she was making her own decisions. Dangerous as their situation was, she felt more free than she had since her mother died. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it on her own terms. The morning came too soon, pale light filtering through the gaps in the cabin walls. Willa woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The events of the previous day rushed back as she saw Hank standing by the window, rifle in hand, scanning the surrounding forest. Any sign of them? She asked, her voice rough with sleep. Hank shook his head. "Nothing yet, but they'll be searching. We need to move." They extinguished the last embers of the fire and removed all signs of their presence. Hank showed her how to brush away their footprints as they left, a skill he'd learned from a Comanche scout during his ranger days. "Where will we get horses?" Willa asked as they set out, heading north through the dense forest. "There's a homestead about 5 miles from here. Family named Callahan. The father was a Union soldier who saved my life at Shiloh. If anyone will help us without asking too many questions, it's him." The journey was difficult. They avoided trails, moving instead through the underbrush and across rocky outcroppings where they would leave no tracks. By midday, Willa's city shoes were falling apart, and her feet were blistered and bleeding. Hank noticed her limping and called a halt beside a small stream. "Let me see," he said, gesturing to her feet. Too tired to be modest, Willa sat on a boulder and removed what remained of her shoes. Hank winced at the sight of her raw, bleeding feet. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked, kneeling to examine the damage. "Complaining wouldn't have made the journey any shorter," Willa replied, trying to hide how much pain she was in. Hank shook his head, a mix of exasperation and admiration in his expression. "You're tougher than you look, Miss Thompson." "Willa," she corrected him. "If we're going to be fugitives together, you might as well use my given name." "Willa," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "Well, Willa, we need to clean these wounds and bind them, or you won't be walking much farther." He tore strips from his own shirt and bathed her feet in the cool stream water. His hands were gentle despite their roughness, and Willa found herself studying his face as he worked. The bruises from the previous night were darkening, but they couldn't hide the strong lines of his jaw or the kindness in his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly when he finished binding her feet. Hank nodded, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's about another hour to the Callahan place. I can carry you if needed." "I can walk," Willa insisted, though the thought of putting weight on her feet again made her want to cry. Hank looked skeptical but didn't argue. Instead, he fashioned a crude pair of moccasins from the leather of his saddlebags, using the torn strips of his shirt to bind them to her feet. "It's not pretty," he said, "but it'll protect you better than those city shoes." The makeshift footwear was surprisingly comfortable, and Willa was able to continue with far less pain. They moved through the forest in companionable silence, Hank occasionally pointing out animal tracks or edible plants, teaching her the basics of survival almost unconsciously. The Callahan homestead came into view just as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen a sturdy log cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, a barn, and fields of wheat stretching toward the forest edge. A young boy of about 12 was chopping wood in the yard. Hank signaled for Willa to wait at the tree line while he approached. She watched as he called out to the boy, who immediately dropped his axe and ran inside. Moments later, a barrel-chested man with a thick beard emerged, a shotgun in his hands. There was a tense moment before recognition dawned on his face, and he lowered the weapon. The two men embraced, and after a brief conversation, Hank waved for Willa to join them. She limped from the shelter of the trees, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance. "Willa, this is Michael Callahan," Hank introduced as she approached. "Michael, Miss Willa Thompson." "Madam," Callahan said with a respectful nod, "any friend of Hank's is welcome here. Come inside before you catch your death." The cabin was warm and smelled of fresh bread. A woman who could only be Mrs. Callahan was stirring something at the stove, while 3 children of various ages stared curiously at the newcomers. "This is my wife, Sarah," Callahan said. "Sarah, you remember Hank Mitchell, the Texas Ranger who saved my husband from bleeding to death?" Sarah said with a warm smile, "How could I forget? Welcome to our home." "Former Ranger," Hank corrected, "and this is Miss Thompson." "You both look like you've been through the wars," Sarah observed, taking in their disheveled state and Hank's bruised face. "Sit, eat. Then you can tell us what kind of trouble you're in." Willa nearly wept at the simple kindness. It had been so long since she'd been treated with basic human decency that it felt almost foreign. Over a hearty meal of venison stew and fresh bread, Hank explained their situation, though he was careful to spare the more frightening details in front of the children. Michael and Sarah exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "Blackwood," Michael said, shaking his head. That man's reach is long. You're right to get as far from here as possible. We need horses, Hank said, and supplies. I can pay. Michael waved him off. Your money's no good here, Hank. You saved my life. 2 horses and whatever supplies you need is small repayment. And the lady needs proper clothes, Sarah added, eyeing Willa's torn dress. I have some things that might fit, not fancy but warm and serviceable. Willa was overwhelmed by their generosity. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how I'll ever repay such kindness. Just live well, Sarah replied simply. That's payment enough. While Sarah helped Willa bathe and change into more suitable traveling clothes, a sturdy wool skirt, cotton blouse, and leather boots that were only slightly too large, Michael and Hank prepared the horses and supplies. 2 days hard riding should get you to your place, Michael said as they worked. Assuming you don't run into trouble. We'll avoid the main trails, Hank assured him, and travel at night when possible. Michael nodded, then lowered his voice. The girl, what's your plan there? Hank glanced toward the house. She needs somewhere safe until Blackwood gives up the search. After that, she wants to head to California. And you're just helping out of the goodness of your heart. Michael's tone was skeptical. I know you, Hank. You don't get involved unless there's something pulling you in. Hank continued checking the saddle straps, not meeting his friend's eyes. She reminds me of Elizabeth. Understanding dawned on Michael's face. Your sister. Not in looks, Hank clarified, but that same spirit. Trapped but not broken. I couldn't save Elizabeth, but maybe I can help Willa. Michael clasped his shoulder. Just be careful. Helping her is one thing. Getting your heart tangled up is another. Hank snorted. My heart's not in danger. This is about doing what's right. If you say so, Michael replied, clearly unconvinced. But I've seen the way you look at her when you think no one's watching. Before Hank could respond, the cabin door opened and Willa emerged in her new clothes. The simple outfit transformed her from a bedraggled fugitive to a capable frontier woman. Her auburn hair was braided neatly, and some of the fear had left her eyes. Michael gave Hank a knowing look before turning to help his son with the supply packs. You look. Hank began, then faltered. More prepared for the journey. Willa smiled, touching the sturdy fabric of her skirt. Sarah is a godsend. She even packed me some extra clothes and a winter coat. Her expression grew serious. These people are risking a lot to help us. They're good folk, Hank agreed. And they know what it means to need help. Michael was on the run himself once, after deserting from the Confederate Army to join the Union. Some debts you never stop repaying. They left as dusk was falling, with warm embraces from the Callahans and promises to send word once they were safely at Hank's ranch. The horses were strong and well-rested, and they made good time through the gathering darkness. Hank led them on a circuitous route, avoiding settlements and staying under the cover of forest when possible. They rode through most of the night, stopping only when the horses needed rest. During one such stop, as they sat beside a small, carefully banked fire, Willa finally asked the question that had been on her mind since their escape. What will happen when Blackwood finds us? Hank looked up from the coffee he was brewing. He won't. You can't be certain of that. He has resources, connections. So do I, Hank replied. And I know how to disappear. My ranch isn't on any map, and the few people who know of its existence have no reason to connect it to me. Willa wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire. He killed his last wife for trying to leave. What do you think he'll do to the man who helped me escape? Hank met her gaze steadily. I'm not easy to kill, Willa, and I've dealt with worse men than Jeremiah Blackwood. You don't know him. I know his kind. Hank poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. Men who buy and sell people. Men who think money and power give them the right to take whatever they want. I spent 8 years hunting men like that with the Rangers. Willa accepted the coffee, letting the warmth seep into her cold hands. And what happened? Why aren't you still with them? A shadow crossed Hank's face. I crossed a line. Went after a man who had political connections, a rancher who was trafficking Mexican girls across the border. The Rangers couldn't officially sanction what needed to be done, so I did it anyway. You killed him, Willa said softly. It wasn't a question. Hank nodded once. Him and 3 of his men. The girls got home safely, but I had to turn in my badge. They sat in silence for a moment, the implications of his confession hanging between them. Willa should have been frightened by this revelation about the man she was trusting with her life. Instead, she felt oddly reassured. Thank you for telling me the truth, she said finally. You should know who you're riding with, Hank replied. I'm not a cold-blooded killer, Willa. But I do what needs doing when the law won't. Like rescuing a woman sold into marriage, she said with a small smile. The corner of Hank's mouth twitched upward. Exactly like that. They finished their coffee in companionable silence before continuing their journey through the night. By dawn, they had covered nearly 30 miles, putting significant distance between themselves and Silver Creek. They made camp in a sheltered ravine, taking turns standing watch while the other slept. Willa found it hard to rest, her mind racing with thoughts of pursuit and the uncertain future ahead. When she did finally drift off, her dreams were filled with Blackwood's cold eyes and the sensation of running without ever getting away. She woke with a start to find Hank kneeling beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. You were crying out, he explained, removing his hand quickly once he saw she was awake. Willa sat up, embarrassed. I'm sorry, just a nightmare. Nothing to apologize for. Hank moved back to his position by the ravine's edge. We all have them. Even you, she asked, curious despite herself. Especially me. He didn't elaborate and Willa didn't press. They rode again as evening approached, pushing hard through the night. The terrain grew more rugged as they moved north, the forests giving way to rocky highlands and deep valleys. Hank seemed to know every trail and stream crossing, navigating with confidence even in the darkness. By the second dawn, Willa could tell they were close to their destination. Hank's posture had relaxed slightly, and he no longer checked behind them quite so often. We're nearly there, he confirmed when she asked. Another few hours. We'll cross Miller's Creek just ahead, then follow the ridge to the east. My land starts where the pine forest meets the meadow. The sun was high in the sky when they crested a hill to see a valley spread out below them. A small cabin stood in a clearing beside a creek, with corrals for horses and a barn nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Willa could make out a vegetable garden and what looked like an orchard of young fruit trees. Someone's there, she said, alarmed by the smoke. Hank smiled. That would be Martha Wilson. She watches the place when I'm away, widow from the next valley over. As they descended into the valley, a large dog came bounding from the cabin, a magnificent creature with thick fur that was indeed a mix of husky and something wild. It ran straight for Hank, nearly knocking him from his horse in its enthusiasm. Down, Wolf, Hank commanded, though his tone was affectionate. Some guard dog you are. The dog turned its attention to Willa, approaching more cautiously, head low and ears alert. Willa remained still on her horse, allowing the animal to circle and sniff. He won't hurt you, Hank assured her. But he likes to make up his own mind about people. After a thorough inspection, Wolf sat beside Willa's horse and looked up at her expectantly. She extended her hand slowly, and he gave it a cursory lick before trotting back to Hank's side. Well, I'll be, Hank said with surprise. He doesn't usually take to strangers so quickly. I've always had a way with animals, Willa replied, pleased by the dog's acceptance. A woman emerged from the cabin as they approached, stout and gray-haired, with a lined face that spoke of years in the sun and wind. She shaded her eyes, then broke into a wide smile. "Hank Mitchell, about time you showed your face. Another week and I'd have claimed this place for myself." Her gaze shifted to Willa, curiosity evident. "And who might this be?" "Martha, this is Miss Willa Thompson," Hank said as they dismounted. "She'll be staying here for a while." "Willa, Martha Wilson, the best neighbor a man could ask for." "Pleased to meet you, madam," Willa said, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance after days on the trail. Martha's shrewd eyes took in the situation: Hank's bruised face, their trail-worn condition, the careful way Hank positioned himself between Willa and the open valley. Understanding dawned in her expression. "Trouble?" she asked simply. "Of the Jeremiah Blackwood variety," Hank confirmed. Martha's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "I see. Well, come inside. I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread cooling. You can tell me what you need over food." The cabin was small but meticulously maintained. A main room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 doors led off to what Willa presumed were bedrooms. Everything was simple but sturdy, built for function rather than beauty. Yet there was a warmth to the place that went beyond the fire and the hearth. Books lined rough-hewn shelves, a handmade quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair, and dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with their fragrance. "It's lovely," Willa said sincerely, running her hand along the smooth wooden table. "It's not much," Hank replied, looking around as if seeing the place through new eyes, "but it's home." Over Martha's hearty stew, Hank explained their situation in greater detail. The older woman listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or frowning as the story unfolded. "Blackwood," she said when he finished. "Bad business, that. My late husband worked one of his mines for a season, said he'd rather starve than go back." "Will you help us?" Hank asked. "Don't even need to ask," Martha replied firmly. "That girl needs protection and you're providing it." "What do you need from me?" "Eyes and ears," Hank said. "If any strangers come asking questions in the area, I need to know. And if anything happens to me, Willa will need help getting to the coast." The matter-of-fact way he discussed the possibility of his own demise sent a chill through Willa. Until now, she hadn't fully considered what Hank was risking by helping her. "Nothing's going to happen to you," she said with more conviction than she felt. Hank gave her a gentle smile. "Probably not, but it's best to be prepared." Martha agreed to spread word among the scattered neighbors to be wary of strangers without revealing Willa's presence. After finishing her meal, she packed her things to return to her own home in the next valley, promising to check in every few days. "The spare bedroom's made up," she told Willa before leaving. "Clean linens and some of my daughter's old clothes in the chest. She's married and living in Oregon now, won't miss them." When Martha had gone, an awkward silence fell between Hank and Willa. The reality of their situation alone together in this isolated cabin suddenly seemed to dawn on both of them. "I'll take the barn," Hank said abruptly. "There's a good bunk out there. You can have the house to yourself." "That's not necessary," Willa protested. "This is your home." "I won't drive you out of it." "It's not proper for us to stay under the same roof," Hank insisted. "Your reputation," Willa laughed, the sound surprising both of them. "My reputation? I'm a fugitive who fled from a forced marriage. I think propriety is the least of my concerns." Hank's expression remained serious. "All the more reason to protect what remains of it. I didn't bring you here to compromise you further." Willa's amusement faded, replaced by genuine appreciation for his consideration. "Thank you, but the cabin has 2 bedrooms with a solid wall between them." I think we can manage to be proper under one roof." After some further discussion, Hank reluctantly agreed to keep his bedroom in the house. They spent the remainder of the day settling in Willa, exploring the cabin and its surroundings, while Hank tended to the horses and checked the property's perimeter. That evening, they shared a simple meal of salt pork and beans that Hank prepared. The domesticity of the scene struck Willa as surreal. Just days ago, she had been facing a life of captivity as Blackwood's wife. Now she was sitting across a table from a former Texas Ranger in a remote cabin, planning how to rebuild her life. "What will you do?" Hank asked as they finished eating. Once Blackwood gives up the search, Willa considered the question. She had been so focused on escape that she had given little thought to what came after. "I still want to go to California," she said finally. "Find work as a teacher, perhaps. I had some schooling before my mother died." "You'd be good at that," Hank observed. "You have a patient way about you." "What about you?" Willa countered. "Will you go back to bounty hunting?" Hank shrugged. "It's what I know. The bounty on James Curtis is still active. He's the man I was tracking when I found you. Once things settle, I'll pick up his trail again." The thought of Hank returning to his dangerous profession sent an unexpected pang through Willa's chest. She had known him only a few days, yet the idea of saying goodbye already felt painful. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for everything." "I don't know that I've properly said it yet." Hank looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Willa said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most people in Silver Creek knew what Blackwood was, what he did to his wives. No one intervened. You were the only one willing to risk yourself for a stranger." Hank was silent for a long moment. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow we'll need to replenish the supplies we used on the journey." That night, lying in the small but comfortable bed in the spare room, Willa listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness around her, the howl of distant wolves, the rustle of wind through pine boughs, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. In the other room, she could hear Hank moving about, his footsteps steady and reassuring. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt safe, not just physically protected but emotionally secure. In this remote cabin, with this quiet, honorable man standing guard, she could begin to heal from the years of fear and uncertainty. She drifted to sleep with a sense of peace she had almost forgotten was possible. The next few weeks fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Hank taught Willa the basics of ranch life: how to care for the few livestock he kept, maintain the vegetable garden, and preserve food for the coming winter. She proved a quick study, eager to contribute and pull her weight. In return, Willa brought order to the cabin's interior, which had clearly been maintained by a man with little interest in domestic comforts. She organized Hank's collection of books, made curtains from fabric Martha brought on her visits, and added touches that transformed the utilitarian space into something more homelike. They worked well together, establishing an easy companionship that required few words. Hank, Willa discovered, was a man of action rather than conversation. He expressed himself through deeds, repairing a loose floorboard before she mentioned it, carving a set of wooden combs when he noticed her struggling to manage her long hair with her single hairbrush, teaching her to shoot his revolver so she could defend herself if necessary. Each small gesture revealed more about him than hours of talk might have. She learned he was meticulous, patient, and unfailingly kind, not just to her but to his animals and to the land itself. He treated his small ranch with a reverence that spoke of a man who had found his place in the world after long searching. For his part, Hank found himself constantly surprised by Willa. The frightened woman he had rescued from Blackwood's mansion had transformed into a determined, capable partner in the daily work of survival. She approached each new task with quiet determination, never complaining about the hardships of frontier life. More than that, she brought light to his solitary existence. Her laughter when Wolf tried to herd the chickens, her quiet humming as she worked in the garden, the thoughtful questions she asked about the books she found on his shelves, all of it filled spaces in his life he hadn't known were empty. Each evening, they would sit by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes talking about their pasts. Willa told him about her mother, a gentle woman who had married Silas out of desperation after her first husband's death left them destitute. "She tried to protect me from him," Willa said one night, staring into the flames. "Took his rages herself so I wouldn't have to. When she died, there was no one left between us." Hank, in turn, shared stories of his ranger days, carefully edited to emphasize the justice rather than the violence. He told her about growing up on a small farm in East Texas, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 16, about joining the Rangers to provide for his younger sister. "Elizabeth was like you in some ways," he said. "Strong-willed, determined to make her own path. But life was hard for a girl alone back then. When Jeremy Coleman came courting with his fine clothes and promises of a better life, she couldn't say no." "What happened to her?" Willa asked gently. Hank's eyes darkened. "Coleman wasn't what he seemed." "He took her to his ranch near the Mexican border and kept her isolated, cut off from me or anyone who cared about her. By the time I found out what was happening, she was changed, broken. She died in childbirth a year later, the baby too." "I'm so sorry," Willa whispered, reaching across the space between them to touch his hand. Hank allowed the contact for a moment before withdrawing. "It was a long time ago, but it's why I couldn't ride away when I saw you in that wagon." The days grew shorter as autumn deepened toward winter. Willa had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months, and there had been no sign of Blackwood's men. Martha reported that strangers had been asking questions in some of the distant settlements, but none had ventured as far as their remote valley. "Maybe he's given up," Willa suggested one evening as they preserved the last of the garden's vegetables for winter storage. Hank shook his head. "Men like Blackwood don't give up. They just change tactics." His caution was well-founded. The very next day, as Hank returned from checking his trap lines in the northern woods, he found fresh tracks crossing his property, 3 riders, moving carefully, trying to stay hidden. He followed the tracks to the ridge overlooking the cabin. From the disturbed ground and cigarette butts left behind, he could tell the men had observed the ranch for some time before departing, heading not back toward Silver Creek, but toward the nearest settlement where they could send telegrams. Hank returned to the cabin, his expression grim. Willa knew immediately that something was wrong. "They found us," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Scouts," Hank confirmed. "Blackwood's men, most likely. They didn't approach, just watched." "What do we do?" "We need to move you," Hank said, already gathering essentials. "The cabin isn't defensible against multiple attackers." "Where will we go?" Willa asked, quickly joining him in packing supplies. "There's an old mining cave in the hills to the west. Few people know about it. We can shelter there while I figure out our next move." They worked quickly, packing only what they would need for several days' food, blankets, weapons, and warm clothing. Hank saddled the horses while Willa prepared a cold supper they could eat on the trail. As dusk fell, they set out, leading the horses through the forest rather than riding to minimize tracks. Wolf trotted ahead, alert for any sign of intruders. The cave was several miles away, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense pine forest and rocky outcroppings. They reached it well after midnight, a deep recess in the mountainside, its entrance partially hidden by fallen boulders. Inside, the space opened up into a cavern large enough to accommodate them and the horses comfortably. Hank built a small fire near the entrance, where the smoke would dissipate through cracks in the rock ceiling without being visible from outside. The dancing flames cast eerie shadows on the cave walls, illuminating ancient pictographs left by long-gone indigenous inhabitants. "We should be safe here for now," Hank said, arranging blankets for Willa on a relatively flat section of cave floor. "I'll keep watch tonight." "You need rest too," Willa protested. "We can take turns." Hank looked like he wanted to argue but eventually nodded. 4-hour shifts. "I'll take first watch." Willa settled onto her makeshift bed, exhaustion overtaking her despite the hard ground and the gravity of their situation. Just before sleep claimed her, she reached out to touch Hank's arm. "Thank you," she murmured, "for keeping me safe. Again." Hank covered her hand with his own, the brief touch conveying more than words could. "Sleep now. We'll figure this out." When Willa woke for her watch, she found Hank sitting at the cave entrance, rifle across his knees, staring out into the night. Wolf lay beside him, ears pricked forward, equally vigilant. "Anything?" she asked, joining him. "Nothing yet," Hank replied, "but they'll be coming. Blackwood won't send just 3 men next time. We could leave," Willa suggested. "Head for California now." Hank shook his head. "Winter's coming. The mountain passes will be dangerous if not impassable, and we'd be exposed on the trail. Our best chance is to hold out here until spring." "That's months away," Willa said, dismayed. "We can't live in this cave until then." "No," Hank agreed. "But we can move between here and the cabin, stay unpredictable. And I have some ideas about how to discourage Blackwood's interest." "What ideas?" Hank turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim firelight. "How would you feel about being a widow?" Willa stared at him, confused. "I don't understand." "If word got back to Blackwood that you were dead, he might call off the search," understanding dawned. "You want to fake my death?" Hank nodded. "It would buy us time. By spring, when the pass is clear, you could head to California under a new name." The plan made sense, but something about it troubled Willa. The idea of leaving in spring, of saying goodbye to Hank and this life they had built together, no longer appealed to her as it once had. "We could try it," she said slowly. "But how would we convince Blackwood?" "Leave that to me," Hank replied. "Get some rest now. Your watch will come soon enough." Over the next few days, they divided their time between the cave and carefully timed visits to the cabin to collect more supplies. Hank set traps not for animals but for men around the perimeter of his property. Simple alarms that would warn them of intruders' approach. One morning, Hank returned from scouting with news. "Riders coming from the east, at least 6 of them. They'll reach the cabin by midday. Blackwood's men." "Most likely. Time to put our plan into action." The plan was simple but risky. They would allow Blackwood's men to find evidence that Willa had died in an accident, a fall from the ridge above the cabin, her body washed away in the creek below. Hank would play the part of the grieving rescuer who had failed to save her. "You'll need to stay hidden in the cave," Hank instructed as they prepared. "No matter what you hear, don't come out until I return for you." Willa nodded, though the thought of Hank facing 6 armed men alone terrified her. "Be careful," she said, impulsively reaching up to touch his bruised face. "I've grown rather accustomed to having you around." Something flashed in Hank's eyes, an emotion quickly suppressed. He caught her hand and held it briefly against his cheek. "I'll come back," he promised. "Wait for me." With Wolf at her side for protection, Willa remained in the cave while Hank rode back to the cabin. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. She strained to hear any sound of conflict, gunshots, shouts, but the cave was too far from the cabin for any noise to reach her. As sunset approached with no sign of Hank, her anxiety grew. Had the plan failed? Was he captured or worse? She paced the cave, torn between her promise to stay hidden and her fear for his safety. Wolf suddenly lifted his head, ears alert. A moment later, he bounded toward the cave entrance, tail wagging. Willa followed, heart in her throat to see Hank climbing the trail toward them. He was dusty and there was blood on his shirt, but he was moving under his own power. "What happened?" she asked as soon as he was within earshot. "Are you hurt?" "Not my blood," Hank assured her. "One of Blackwood's men got trigger-happy. His partner paid the price. Did they believe it?" "About me," Hank nodded, accepting the water she offered. "They found the torn piece of your dress by the ridge, the blood trail leading to the creek. Your boot washed up downstream where I planted it. Their leader man named Vickers was suspicious at first, but the evidence was convincing. So it worked. They think I'm dead. They're taking the news back to Blackwood," Hank confirmed. "Whether he believes it is another matter." They returned to the cabin the next day, watchful but hopeful that their ruse had succeeded. The place had been searched thoroughly, drawers emptied and furniture overturned, but nothing of value was missing. "They were looking for evidence that you were still alive," Hank explained as they set the cabin to rights. "Or perhaps proof that you weren't." "And now we wait," Willa said, straightening the bookshelf that had been emptied onto the floor. "Now we wait," Hank agreed. "But we stay vigilant. Blackwood may send someone else to verify the story." The waiting was the hardest part. Days stretched into weeks with no sign of pursuit, but the constant vigilance took its toll. Hank set alarms and traps around the property, never relaxed his guard. Willa learned to sleep lightly, to carry a weapon even when working in the garden, to scan the horizon habitually for any sign of approaching riders. Yet despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, something was changing between them. The shared danger created an intimacy that transcended their initial roles as rescuer and rescued. They moved around each other with increasing familiarity, anticipating needs, communicating with glances and gestures as much as words. Willa found herself watching Hank when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his shoulders as he chopped wood, the gentleness in his hands as he tended an injured fox kit they'd found, the rare smile that transformed his serious face when she said something that amused him. For his part, Hank increasingly found reasons to remain close to the cabin rather than ranging far afield as had been his habit. He expanded the garden to give Willa more to work with, built shelves for her growing collection of preserves, even fashioned a crude loom so she could weave the wool from his small flock of sheep. Winter arrived in earnest, blanketing the valley in snow and ice. The isolation that had felt threatening now became a comfort. Few travelers would brave the mountain passes in such weather, giving them a respite from constant vigilance. On Christmas Eve, Hank surprised Willa by bringing in a small pine tree and setting it up in the corner of the main room. "I thought we could use some cheer," he said almost apologetically. "My mother always insisted on a tree, even in the leanest years." Willa was touched by the gesture. "It's perfect. I haven't celebrated Christmas properly since my mother died." They decorated the tree with strings of dried berries, pine cones dusted with flour to look like snow, and a star Hank had carved from wood. The simple decorations transformed the cabin, making it feel festive despite their circumstances. That evening they shared a special meal: venison Hank had smoked earlier in the fall, preserved vegetables from their garden, and a precious bottle of wine Martha had brought on her last visit before the heavy snows. "To survival," Hank said, raising his cup in a toast. "To new beginnings," Willa countered, touching her cup to his. They sat before the fire long into the night, the wine loosening their usual reserve. Willa told stories of Christmases from her childhood, of her mother's efforts to make the day special even when they had little. She would save egg whites for months to make angel cookies, Willa recalled, smiling at the memory. They were usually stale by Christmas, but I thought they were magical. Your mother sounds like an extraordinary woman, Hank said softly. She was. Willa's smile turned sad. She would have liked you, I think. She always said to judge a man by how he treats those who can offer him nothing in return. And how would I measure up? Willa met his gaze across the firelight. You risked everything for a woman you didn't know. I think she would have approved. Something shifted in Hank's expression, a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. Willa. A sudden howl from Wolf, stationed outside, cut off whatever he had been about to say. They both froze, listening intently. Wolf rarely made noise without cause. Hank was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Stay here, he instructed, moving to the window. He peered out into the snowy darkness, every sense alert. After a long moment, he relaxed slightly. It's Martha, he said with relief. She's riding in alone. Willa joined him at the window to see a bundled figure on horseback approaching through the swirling snow. Wolf prancing alongside the horse like an honor guard. They hurried outside to help Martha dismount, the older woman stiff with cold after her journey. Mercy, but it's a bitter night for traveling, she said as they ushered her inside to the fire. But I had to come. News couldn't wait. What news? Hank asked, pouring her a cup of the mulled wine. Martha accepted the drink gratefully, warming her hands around the cup. Blackwood, she said after taking a deep swallow. He's dead. Willa sank into a chair, the words not fully registering. Dead? How? Shot in the back outside his own saloon 3 nights ago, Martha replied. Word just reached our settlement yesterday. They're saying it was a business rival, but rumors are flying. Hank's expression was unreadable. Any mention of his search for Miss Thompson? Martha shook her head. Not that I heard, but there's more. The new owner of the Silver Queen mine, Blackwood's biggest holding, is looking for the former Mrs. Thompson. Seems Blackwood had a will naming her as beneficiary to a portion of his estate, should she become his wife. But we were never married, Willa said, confused. Doesn't matter, Martha replied. The new owner fellow named Harrison says it's a matter of honor to fulfill Blackwood's last wishes. He's offering a substantial sum to the poor grieving bride-to-be who lost her intended. Hank and Willa exchanged a look of disbelief. It could be a trap, Hank warned. A way to lure you back. Or it could be legitimate, Martha countered. Harrison has a reputation as an honest businessman, nothing like Blackwood. Even if it's genuine, I want nothing of Blackwood's, Willa said firmly. His money is tainted with the blood of his previous wives. Martha nodded approvingly. I thought you might say that. That's why I took the liberty of speaking to Harrison myself. You what? Hank and Willa exclaimed in unison. Now, don't look at me like that, Martha said defensively. I didn't reveal where you were. I simply introduced myself as a friend of the bereaved Willa Thompson, who was in seclusion following the tragic news of her fiancé's death. And what did this Harrison say? Hank asked, still looking troubled. He was most understanding, Martha replied. Asked me to convey his condolences and this. She reached into her coat and withdrew an envelope. It's a bank draft for $5,000. He called it a token of Blackwood's esteem, though between us, I suspect it's more a token of Harrison's relief at acquiring the mines without complication. Willa stared at the envelope Martha placed on the table. $5,000, a fortune that would secure her future, allow her to start fresh anywhere she chose. I can't accept it, she said finally. Why ever not? Martha asked, bewildered. It's clean money, girl. Harrison made his fortune in shipping, not on the backs of miners. And Blackwood's dead, he'll never know one way or the other. It's not about Blackwood, Willa tried to explain. It would feel like I was still being bought and sold. She looked to Hank, hoping he would understand. He nodded slightly. "It's your decision, Willa. No one will force you one way or the other." Martha looked between them, something like understanding dawning in her eyes. "Well," she said after a moment, "the draft will keep. You don't need to decide tonight. The important thing is that Blackwood is gone. You're free to come out of hiding." The news should have brought relief, excitement even. Instead, Willa felt strangely hollow. For months, her life had been defined by escaping Blackwood, first physically, then by hiding from his pursuit. With that threat removed, she was truly free to leave to pursue her California dreams. Yet the prospect no longer filled her with anticipation. Somewhere along the way, this remote cabin with its simple routines and the quiet man who shared them had become more than a refuge. It had become home. Martha stayed the night, sleeping in Willa's room while Willa took the small cot in the main room. In the morning, declining their offers to escort her back to her own homestead, Martha departed with promises to visit again when the weather allowed. After she left, an awkward silence fell between Hank and Willa. The unspoken question hung in the air. "What now? Spring will be here before we know it," Hank said finally, staring out the window at the snow-covered valley. "The passes to California will open by April." Willa's heart sank at his words. He was already planning for her departure. "Yes," she said quietly, "I suppose they will. You could take that bank draft," Hank continued, still not looking at her. "Set yourself up properly in San Francisco, open a school perhaps." "I could," Willa agreed, though the idea no longer held the appeal it once had. Hank turned to face her, his expression carefully neutral. "Is that still what you want, California?" Willa met his gaze, searching for some hint of what he wanted her to say. "I don't know any more," she admitted. "So much has changed." "You don't have to decide right away," Hank said, his tone gentle. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to figure things out." It wasn't what she had hoped to hear. Courtesy rather than invitation, kindness rather than desire. Willa nodded, swallowing her disappointment. "Thank you. I appreciate your hospitality." They settled back into their routines, but something had changed. A constraint had entered their interactions, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. Hank spent more time away from the cabin, checking trap lines or hunting, while Willa threw herself into domestic tasks with almost frantic energy. Winter slowly released its grip on the valley, snow melting to reveal the first tentative shoots of spring grass. The days grew longer, the sun warmer. And still, they circled each other like wary dancers, neither willing to speak the words that might bridge the growing distance between them. One evening, as Willa sat by the fire mending one of Hank's shirts, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "I've been thinking," he began, setting aside the knife he'd been sharpening. "About your future." Willa's hand stilled, her heart beating faster. "Oh, the stage to Helena will start running again next week. From there, you could take the train west." He spoke matter-of-factly, as if discussing a simple business arrangement. "I can provide you with enough funds for the journey, in addition to the draft from Harrison, should you choose to accept it." Willa struggled to keep her expression neutral despite the pain his words caused. "You seem eager to be rid of me," she said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. Hank looked startled. "No, that's not," he broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I just want you to have the life you deserve, Willa, the one you've been planning." "And what if my plans have changed?" she asked quietly. "How so?" Willa set the mending aside and stood, gathering her courage. "What if I no longer want to go to California? What if I've found something here that means more to me than teaching in some city school?" Hank went very still. "Willa," he said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely displayed. "Don't say things you don't mean out of gratitude or misplaced affection. Misplaced affection, Willa repeated, indignant now. Is that what you think this is? That I'm some confused girl who doesn't know her own mind? No, because I know exactly what I want, Hank Mitchell. I want this life, the garden and the chickens and the long winter evenings by the fire. I want this valley and these mountains. And most of all, I want the man who gave me back my freedom and never once asked for anything in return. Hank stared at her, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. You can't mean that. You deserve better than a former lawman with blood on his hands and a remote cabin miles from civilization. Don't tell me what I deserve, Willa said fiercely. I've had enough of men deciding my fate for me. I'm choosing this life. I'm choosing you, unless. Her courage faltered slightly. Unless you don't want me to stay. In answer, Hank crossed the room in 2 strides and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that belied his strength. Want you to stay, he echoed, his voice hoarse. Willa, the thought of you leaving has been tearing me apart for months, but I couldn't ask you to give up your dreams for this place, for me. You are my dream now, Willa whispered, reaching up to touch his face. You and this life we've built together. Hank closed his eyes briefly, as if savoring her words. When he opened them again, they burned with an intensity that took her breath away. I love you, he said simply. I think I have since that first day in Silver Creek, when you looked at me from that wagon with more courage than most men show in a lifetime. I love you too, Willa replied, the words feeling both momentous and utterly natural. Enough to know that California holds nothing for me if you're not there. His kiss was gentle at first, almost reverent, but deepened as Willa responded with all the emotion she'd been holding back for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Hank rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said softly. Not because you need protection or a place to stay, but because we belong together. Because I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you every night for the rest of our lives. Yes, Willa answered without hesitation. Yes to all of it. They were married 2 weeks later in Martha's front parlor, with the widow presiding as both witness and enthusiastic celebrant. Wolf served as reluctant ring bearer, the simple gold band tied to his collar with a blue ribbon. The bank draft from Harrison remained untouched, sealed in an envelope in Hank's desk drawer. Willa had no need for Blackwood's money, tainted or not. She had found something far more valuable, a home where she was cherished, a life built on choice rather than coercion, and a love that had begun with an act of courage and grown into something neither of them had expected. 5 years later, Willa stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Hank teach their 4-year-old son, Thomas, how to gently handle a newborn lamb. Their 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, named for Hank's sister, played nearby under Wolf's watchful eye, the aging dog having appointed himself guardian of both children from the moment they were born. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. The garden had expanded into a productive farm, the fruit trees were bearing abundantly, and Hank's innovative breeding of cold, hardy sheep had attracted buyers from as far away as Canada. Willa's hand rested on her rounded belly, where their 3rd child grew. Life in the northern Montana wilderness wasn't easy, but it was rich with purpose and love. Each day brought challenges, but they faced them together, their partnership strengthened by the knowledge that they had chosen each other freely and completely. As she watched her family in the golden afternoon light, Willa thought of how far she had come from that desperate young woman in Silas's wagon. The journey from captivity to freedom had been perilous, but every step had led her here, to this moment, to this life that was more fulfilling than any she could have imagined. Hank looked up and caught her watching. His smile, once so rare, now a daily gift, warmed her heart as it always did. He whispered something to Thomas, who carefully set down the lamb and came running toward the porch, his father following at a more measured pace with Elizabeth in his arms. "Mama," Thomas called. "Pa says we can name the new lamb, and the baby too when it comes." Willa laughed, ruffling her son's hair as he reached her. "Does he now? And what names have you chosen?" Thomas launched into an elaborate explanation, involving his favorite storybook characters as Hank joined them, pressing a kiss to Willa's temple before setting Elizabeth down to toddle after her brother. "Happy?" Hank asked quietly, his arm slipping around her waist. Willa leaned into his embrace, watching their children play in the yard that had once seemed so empty and now overflowed with life. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied. "You gave me more than a way out, Hank. You gave me a home." "We gave it to each other," he corrected gently. "And we build it anew every day." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and purple, Willa offered a silent thanks to whatever fate or providence had brought her to this place, to this man. She had been sold into marriage, but found instead a love freely given and freely accepted, the most precious freedom of all.